Okay, welcome. Hello. Welcome back to our live stream series this month. We are on day 2 of 3 of exploring some live Q&A based on comments and different questions and observations that have popped up in my online community. And today we are going to be taking a look at the radical truth about love bombing plus 6 signs to spot a love bomber. So I'm excited to dive into today's material. As you are joining me here on the call, feel free to type your name and where you are coming from in the chat box there, and I'll give you a shout out after we get through this first piece of the content. And then in the second half of the video, I will respond to Q&A. So if you have ever had the experience of a partner coming on too strong, maybe giving you a lot of extravagant gifts or wowing you with over-the-top dates and romantic gestures, or constantly texting you sweet nothings, being super duper flattering, until you start to show some reciprocation, and then all of a sudden they ghost you, then it's likely that you have been what's sometimes referred to as love bombed. Okay. So if you want to learn more about what love bombing is and why people do it, then you're going to want to stick around for this segment, because we're going to be defining love bombing, and I'm also going to give you 6 signs of what to look out for. We're also going to dig into the psyche of the love bomber and figure out why they might be doing it. And we're also going to examine how both anxious and avoidantly attached individuals can be guilty of love bombing. And so if you don't know me, or you're just joining me here for the first time, my name is Brianna McWilliam, and I am an author, educator, and a licensed and board-certified creative arts therapist. I've been in the field for about 13 years now, and I use psycho-spiritual approaches with creative arts interventions to help individuals struggling with insecure attachment go from feeling fearful and confused in their relationships to achieving what I refer to as a sense of self-sovereignty and calling in those passionate partnerships that they want, without having to talk in circles around their feelings for hours or even years on end with no tangible result. And the approach I use is called the MAC method, which stands for Mastery, Awareness, and Creativity. And there's 3 facets to this, which is cognitive reframing, body activation, and arts-based experientials. So today, the information we're going to be exploring is intended to bust some damaging misconceptions and support some cognitive reframing. Specifically, that true love bombing is really not about what did you do wrong to suddenly scare the person off, or how did you push them away and turn them off. It's actually usually more the result of a conflict going on within that person. How you respond to the situation, however, may be a reflection of the conflicts within you, and therein lie the deeper lessons and meaning that you might derive from that experience. So let's just dive right in. What is love bombing exactly? Well, maybe you have just started dating somebody and it feels like sparks are flying initially. There seems to be the seeds of potential there between you, and perhaps something significant could grow. And you're open to it, the possibility of it. Sure, why not follow it and see what happens? Then suddenly, this person tends to kind of turn the volume up to full blast. The texts start coming nonstop. They start professing divine providence and feeling as if they just know that you're meant to be together. They show up with extravagant flowers and gifts and take you out on these great dates. They sort of inundate you with future talking and flattery. They might surprise you with dinner at their parents' house only 3 dates in. And at first, you might feel a sense of apprehension and distrust. How could they possibly feel that way about you so quickly? They barely know you. You barely know them. It's likely they have a script prepared, and every date that you go out, it's almost as if you're just trying to fit their bill. Now, at that point, there's 2 things that usually happen. And the first is you listen to your gut and you kind of bow out and you tell them that you're not really feeling it. And then you try to ignore the barrage of text messages that you'll get over the next 2 to 3 weeks until they give up trying to convince you otherwise. The second thing that happens is perhaps you're a bit heartbroken over a recent breakup and you've been desperate for the validation lately. So you kind of let it go on more than you should have, when otherwise you might not have. And maybe you've been working on self-help and personal development, and so you try to adopt a positive attitude. You tell yourself something like, well, maybe I'm being too avoidant. Perhaps I really have met someone who just sees how great I am, even if I just don't feel so great myself lately. Maybe I'm just cynical because I got my heart broken. Maybe I should give it more of a chance and just see what happens. So you attempt to reciprocate some of what you've been receiving, and you decide, maybe I am going to invest more of myself emotionally here. Then it's almost like once you make that decision, out of nowhere, the attention stops. Like a record scratch, it kind of comes to a grinding halt. And you start getting blamed for things and they start seeming to turn everything around on you. They are very provocative. It looks as if they're trying to pick fights out of nowhere. Or maybe they stand you up a few times and they claim that it was your fault for miscommunicating the details of that. And if you're in a roller coaster relationship with partners who tend to love bomb, usually after there is an intense bombing, there will be a period of emotional distance, right? So after a volley, you find your partner pulling away again. Their affections start to fade, okay? Now, if you're in a new dating situation, just when you decide that you might be willing to give it a real shot, that's when they start to kind of fall off the map and or ghost you. And sometimes there's little to no explanation for it. So if this sounds familiar, then it's likely you have experienced some form of love bombing. And I wanted to share with you a couple of examples. These are real life examples from people who were willing to share what had happened to them to illustrate this point. So here's one example. I had a boyfriend who was like two different people. When he wanted to hoover me back in and get me to engage with his drama, he'd start getting really lovey-dovey. He'd go on about how he'd never been with a woman like me and he's never had love like that, etc., etc. I only saw it as love bombing after I left and truly realized how damaging it was. Here's another example. This guy would call me every day on his lunch break and again when he would get off of work, and we'd talk for hours. He would take me on dates and talk about doing things or going places in the future. He would tell me how beautiful and perfect I am and would tell me that I'm the only one who makes him feel relaxed and at peace. I had experienced love bombing before that, so I felt like it was a little phony, like he was telling me things I thought I wanted to hear in order to fill a void or boost his ego. So I would always kind of feel apprehensive thinking that treatment towards me had an expiration date. And after a few months, it did. The minute I let my guard down and started to trust the consistency, he started acting cold and distant. He would get mad over trivial things, block my number, then call a few days trying to be overly nice and telling me he blocked me because I needed to be punished. Now I waste time wondering if the fact that I was feeling apprehensive instead of embracing his initial loving behavior made that 180-degree self-fulfilling prophecy, or whether I was actually listening to my intuition. Here's another example. I had this happen to me on a second date. Flowers, chocolates, stuffed animals, and lotions, all delivered to me hours before our date. Unfortunately, during our second date, he began describing his dream wedding. It was an instant turnoff. It felt as if it didn't matter who I was. He just wanted a piece to fit into the picture perfect puzzle. Here's another example. Love bombing, planning for a future, promising me security, loads of love and affection, romance, and then it flips and usually he blames me that I didn't love him enough. He didn't feel loved enough. And I can no longer put up with this drama and hope that he starts to recognize when he enters into a new relationship, because I'm sure this is going to happen again. Here's another example. It was part of a weird push-pull dynamic. Like she was trying to build up my ego with extreme compliments and praises, constantly texting me that she missed me and wanted to come over. Then secretive behaviors and withdrawing, putting me down, ending the relationship. Then silence for weeks, followed by text bombs for reconnection. I bought into her apology several times because she seemed like she was really owning up to things, but each time I came back, she was more affectionate and close for a longer duration, but then the same thing would happen all over again. Wash, rinse, repeat. So these are a few examples of love bombing. And if any of these resonate with you, I would love to see it there in the chat box, just to know that we are hitting on something here. Let's see, we've got a few people joining us here. Hello, Rubino, Roller Girl. Hello there, Rebecca, Sarah. Great. Sarah says, I've been love bombed. Crazy energy. It's what led me to research things online. You turned out to be a pathological narcissist. Your content is really helping me. Rebecca says, yikes, these stories are so disturbing, but also not uncommon. Emil says, yeah, isn't love bombing a typical sign for a person with a narcissistic personality disorder? I wouldn't go that far. I think a lot of people do it, particularly if they are caught up in a fantasy. And a lot of individuals with insecure attachment who don't meet the criteria for a disorder love bomb. So that actually leads us to the next part of this, which is, why do people act this way? So Individuals who love bomb, they typically experience a significant disconnect from their authentic selves, which I sometimes refer to as your inner being, your true self, or your essential self. And they spend a lot of time dissociated from the painful feelings generated by that disconnect. So usually that kind of dissociation manifests as a very active fantasy life. And so they often have a very vivid picture and script for what they think the ideal relationship would look and feel like, one that would fill them up and make them happy and connect them to themselves. And when they find someone that meets an approximation to that, they feel enthralled, and there is a powerful sense of urgency compelling them to secure that relationship, often by some kind of dramatic means. And so once a person becomes an active participant in this dramatic play, however, rather than just responding to the cues of the love bombing director, the fantasy necessarily has to adjust to accommodate for the reality of the whole person. And because of this, online dating and long distance relationships are really a hotbed for love bombing, because there's plenty of mental, emotional, and geographical distance to fill up with a fantasy of reality for longer periods of time. And so how the love bomber responds once things get real usually is indicative of what their attachment style might be. So let's talk a little bit about what attachment styles have to do with this. So it's important to realize that both open hearts, what I refer to as anxiously attached individuals, and rolling stones, what I refer to as avoidantly attached individuals, love bomb, because both are particularly subject to entertaining romantic fantasies, usually in the 3 to 6 months of a relationship. And I would say that all love bombers experience insecure attachment, but not everyone with insecure attachment is necessarily a love bomber. So fantasy plays a significant role when we have insecure attachment for 2 reasons. And the first is that it provides a form of wish fulfillment and escape, which may lead to, in a positive way, productive creative outlets, an ability to abstract, analyze, intellectualize. And of course, these are all useful tools in an external working world. Secondly, however, when fantasy becomes a default mechanism for avoiding intimacy by chasing down an impossible standard, it starts to foster an idealization as a defense mechanism. And that keeps our energy kind of stuck in our heads in these fantasy worlds and unable to experience real shifts in our emotional, or otherwise called affectual states, which is to say that our energy hangs out up here and it doesn't quite filter down into the body. And the body is where we actually feel things, okay? So fantasy kind of gives us this ability to predict outcomes. It allows us to play with abstract ideas and to kind of stretch the imagination. Abstraction and imagination is required to be effectively analytical and intellectual, as well as creative. But intellectualism, overanalysis, and creativity are also hallmarks of individuals with insecure attachment. And so there are positive strengths. These can be positive strengths and attributes with which a lot of insecure individuals manage to accomplish a wonderfully great measure of success in their careers and in their platonic relationships. And yet, when it comes to romance, the power of fantasy starts to lead us down this path of disappointment and sometimes disillusionment. And so first we fantasize of a perfect partner that's going to swoop in and make us feel loved in a way that we never felt loved before. And then we compare our partners to this idealization, and we find that our real felt experience is lacking. And when that partner starts to step in and become a more active participant, we find them lacking. And secondly, we sense the fantasies and desires of our partners. And if we have a disconnect to the self, we kind of desperately need to avoid their rejection and abandonment because we experience ourselves through their eyes. So we end up putting on a mask or a persona to try to become whatever we think their fantasy might be. And so this kind of goes on typically until we arrive at this sort of unavoidable sense of either boredom, resentment, anger, or emotional vacancy and spiritual aridity in the relationship. And so some of us get there quicker than others because we spend too much time in the fantasy world. Now, at this point, oftentimes anxious partners are less willing to release whomever the chosen partner is because they have that's a quality of their attachment style. They want to remain connected, but they're also unwilling to release whatever the fantasy may have been. So they're more likely to cling to a partner for a long time and to attempt to convince, cajole, seduce, manipulate, browbeat, or otherwise sometimes even punish a partner into complying with whatever their fantasy for the relationship is for as long as they can, even if they go through periods of boredom and resentment themselves. If they are prone to love bombing, there's a level of drama that they require to feel connected in a relationship. And so they will always find ways to keep the relationship emotionally charged, because otherwise they don't trust the connection because they don't feel a connection to themselves. Okay. Now, avoidant partners are more likely to release the partner and search for a new person to try to fit the mold. And so the fantasy in this case is what has to be preserved above all else. And if a person won't comply willingly, then that person's not worth the effort. So the Rolling Stone is oriented towards freedom and not missing out on what they perceive to be their opportunities. So like a switch, their attention to their partners gets kind of turned off, and they're looking for a new actor to kind of fill in the script. So in summary, these are more or less the 6 signs to help you recognize if you're being love bombed, whether it's by someone who's more avoidantly attached or more anxiously attached. So number 1, usually the text messages and the phone calls escalate quickly and the content becomes overtly erotic or romantic, and it tends to contain a lot of over-the-top flattery. Secondly, the dates are lengthy and a bit intense, and while they may be fun in the moment, you kind of end the date feeling a bit exhausted and relieved when it's over. Thirdly, when you set a completely normal and appropriate boundary, the love bomber will come across as feeling deeply wounded and offended, as if you have rebuffed them. And fourth, if you persist with setting these boundaries, they may become increasingly insistent until you give in. So they'll likely launch a campaign to convince you that your perfectly appropriate apprehension is truly inappropriate cynicism, and how it's clear that you belong together. Fifth, if you do give in, however, and begin to reciprocate in a similar fashion, suddenly the love bomber goes from hot to cold, because once you become an active participant, you threaten to spoil that fantasy. And lastly, number 6, eventually the love bomber's amorous affections tend to fade away rather quickly, somehow making the decline of the relationship your fault. Or if it's a new budding thing and they disappear, they just leave without warning. They fall off the map, they ghost you. So I hope that this video has helped you to fully grasp the concept of love bombing, and I would love to see more comments and stories in the feed there if this has happened to you. And again, if you only have a short amount of time today, if you'd like to stay tuned for more content like this, remember to like, subscribe, and ring the bell for notifications. I usually release a video a week or 2, and I go live at least once a month, sometimes 2 or 3 times a month, to answer questions. And if you want to learn more about attachment styles, there's a quiz in the caption of this video, as well as a link to my website where I sell online courses in the subject. So now I want to just address some of the comments we have here in the feed. I'd love to hear how do we behave in the face of love bombing? That's a great question. I keep thinking I'm falling more and more in love with him. Okay. Yeah. I keep thinking I'm falling more and more in love with him. Okay. Would love bombing take place almost a year into the relationship? I'm slightly guilty of this, but I think of myself as a generous person without expectations. Would an anxious person love bomb the same way as an avoidant would? So I kind of touched upon that there in the video. This guy sent me roses, lingerie, flowers, 3 bouquets in 1 week, lovey-dovey text, 5-hour convos. Definitely did have an insecure attachment style. He told me all the time that he was insecure. Yeah, that sounds like love bombing. Wow, that's a lot. Okay, so I want to go back and take a look at one of these questions. So I keep thinking I'm falling more and more in love with him. Well, it depends on what his behavior is. I'm not quite sure what your situation is, so I don't want to make any assumptions. This is for Rubino. So I don't really know how to comment on that. But if you feel yourself falling in love with someone, but you have to kind of tease out, is this because of a fantasy? Is there something in the way he's behaving that is making you feel in touch with an aspect of yourself? And are you in love with the idea of being in love, or are you actually in love with that person? So sometimes in the past, I've had conversations with individuals that have felt very enthralled with someone and it didn't work out kind of abruptly. And what you really want to think about is, when you think about this person, what are the characterological things about them that you love, right? What is their character like? How do they behave when someone is sick? Are they consistent? Do they follow through on what they say they're going to do? Have you met their friends? Like, what are their friends like? It takes time to really get to know someone and to be able to trust their character well enough to determine whether or not your emotional investment is really safe with that person. I think some studies say it takes up to 3 years to really get to know someone. Others say it's not that long. It's like 6 months before you can start to feel like you can trust somebody. So, I mean, of course, everybody's relationship trajectory is going to be different, but I would, if you feel yourself kind of becoming enthralled with the fantasy and enthralled with the idea of being in love and enthralled with the idea of being connected, I would just have you drop into yourself and notice if it's the attention that you're enthralled with, if it's how that person makes you feel that you are enthralled with, because that's different than recognizing someone as having a great character and recognizing someone as being, a genuinely admirable person, and you are in love with them because of who they are, not because of how they make you feel. And it's not that an admirable person can't make you feel inspired, particularly if you're in their presence. Oftentimes we find ourselves gravitating towards people of good character because we feel good in their presence, right? But just notice, is that feeling generated because of what they're doing for you, or because of the attention they're giving you, or because of something that you are receiving that's filling you up? Or are you feeling inspired and enthralled with them because they themselves have an amazing character, and in and of their own right, they're such a super cool person, right? That's usually one way to kind of sift through that a little bit. Okay. There's another question in here. How do you behave in the face of love bombing? Well, I would say this is where a lot of the work that I've talked about on this channel kind of comes in. You become aware of your boundaries. This is why always being in a practice of self-exploration is really useful, because once you start to be very aware of your boundaries and knowing what is and is not comfortable for you, and when you start feeling that sense of apprehension, like, whoa, what was it? 3 bouquets in 1 week, lovey-dovey text, 5-hour conversations, and lingerie. It's like, in the space of 1 week, that's like, whoa, like, that's not even about you anymore. That's being in love with being in love, right? And when you've got someone who's in love with being in love, then it's really nothing to do with you. It really is about a script that they've got playing in their heads, and they're just looking for someone who, fits the demographic so that they can insert you into that script. And this is not to, and this is, of course, not without judgment, because I think we all do this to some degree. When we experience a level of infatuation, we put a lot of our hopes and dreams for what we can accomplish in relationship onto someone that we immediately feel attracted to. But when it gets to the point of love bombing, now that's typically someone who doesn't have very good boundaries. And by virtue of that fact, they have a pretty significant disconnect from themselves. So they're going to be sort of relying very heavily on you as a point of focus that allows them to feel more collected within themselves. Like, they're kind of holding you as a point of focus to feel more connected to themselves. And so they connect to themselves through you, but you are not them. Right? That's actually a merged state, typically the result of some form of enmeshment. And as we've talked about before, people respond to enmeshment in different ways based on temperament, meaning they become either more avoidant or more anxious, sometimes more disorganized if it was a more traumatic situation, right? So this is someone who really probably does not have very good boundaries. So how do you respond to someone who doesn't have good boundaries? Be really good about your boundaries, right? Be really good about your boundaries, and be really good about when they say and or do something, tuning into how you feel in your body, locating it, trying to, it depends on how in touch you are with your feelings and how much you allow for your feelings. But if you're someone who doesn't have a large vocabulary for feeling states, then I would have you draw it. Like whatever feeling you've got, just get it on the page. What colors, what lines, what shapes would it look like? And then ascribe some feelings to it, like have a dialogue with it. And then you're like, okay, so that is apprehension. Why would I be feeling apprehensive? Well, because I'm not quite distrusting their investment here, because I know I haven't really proven anything of my character to them at this point to warrant that much aplomb, right? Or to warrant that much, oh, my big words coming out of my mouth today, to warrant that much amorous attention, right? And if you're feeling sometimes too, when people give that much, they're trying to obligate you to give back just as much, right? So sometimes there may be a part of you that feels like, I don't owe you that. And like, don't give me so much, like expecting that I'm going to be able to return that. And then don't get mad when I don't, because what you're offering is not really appropriate according to the boundaries, right? And so I guess that would be my answer to that. When you encounter someone who has very few boundaries, try to be aware of and stick to your boundaries. Oh, good. I'm glad you enjoyed the art therapy videos. Yes, that's the part when I was talking about the MAC method before. Today, we're focusing on cognitive reframing in these live stream series yesterday and today. And tomorrow we'll probably do a more body activation and arts-based experiential, which is like the other two steps in the MAC method. But that's the part where you really get to get it out of you and be engaged in conversation with it. Here's another question. What do I do when he tries to use love bombing in place of true intimacy? Tries to use love bombing in place of true intimacy. Maybe you can give me a more concrete example of what you're talking about there. In place of true intimacy. Well, the thing is a love bomber is not going to really understand what true intimacy is. They're sort of, they're putting the behaviors, the actions, the manifestations of love bombing is like when you put on a costume, right? Yeah, you put on a costume because you want to experience it. You want to have a taste of what that feels like. And you feel like if you can, this is what I said before, like sometimes we can sense the fantasies of our partners and we try to step into them. And I'm sure that if you've struggled with this, then you have some sense of what that is. But like someone who gets to the point of love bombing, like they don't know when to take it off. Like they don't know how and when to take it off. It's just like an extreme end of that. So, and all of us, even people who have insecure attachment, experience that to some degree. Like you can look at your partner across the room, and if you're, a connected couple, you can have a sense of what's going through their head. And sometimes we make a decision whether or not we're going to enter into that, I'm going to call it a play space, but enter into that psychic emotional space with a partner because you know what's going through their mind. So you kind of make a choice of how to respond to it. Right. And when you make a choice of how to respond to a partner, if you've been trained to respond by complying, right, or if you've been trained to respond by assuaging whatever upset they're going through at the cost of yourself, then you're always wearing a costume and you're always in performance mode and you're going to get depressed and anxious and exhausted eventually. And so that has a short shelf life. Now, all of us do it to some degree. It's in some level, it's the seeds of empathy. But remember, to have real empathy, you can be able to sense that, but then also be aware of where your boundaries lie in relationship to that and be able to honor the boundaries well enough that your partner can feel safe sharing what it is that they're experiencing with you without feeling like they're going to blow you over, right? Because then it's not safe for them to share it with you. Okay, he won't show his true self. And Vivian says, I don't think they know who they are. Right, exactly. Right. Well, you can only be authentic to the degree that you know yourself. Right? You can only be authentic to the degree that you know yourself. So for someone who struggles to know themselves, it's difficult for them to be authentic. And that's why a lot of times when we look at relationship dynamics, and sometimes people are like, give me the tips, tricks, and tools on how to make this work or how to make this relationship work. And it's like, you can share like behavioral recommendations, but if you don't know who you are, those are like a Band-Aid on an oozing wound, like on a gunshot wound, really. You have to, it starts from the inside out. And if you have Two partners who are willing to be an active process with looking at who they are, then the more they're willing to be on that inward journey, then the more they can show up authentically in this relational space, right? So it's a dynamic thing. And so it's like, it's not just, relationships are not just pouring everything you have into it and trying to make this thing that's going on between you work. It's equally, you have to also, it's not just like this, it's also like this. So you have like, so if this is going into you and this is going into the relationship, they both have to be kind of operating in this way. Like the energy has to flow in that way. It can't all just be going like this, because then eventually you will empty out and you have to excuse yourself from that relationship. And whether that means breaking up with someone, or whether that means just emotionally withdrawing, whether that means becoming depressed and withdrawn in that way, or it's a form of self-abandonment, right? Okay. So I also wanted to address, there were a few questions that came up on the video yesterday. So I'm just going to pull up my phone here. Okay, I'm glad that was helpful. Yesterday, we had some wonderful comments on the video for, what did I talk about yesterday? Rescuing, that's right.
Broadway's best musical is...
Let's see. I'd like to understand more about what you talked about regarding turning anger inward as a rescuer. I find I become the rescuer without realizing, and then I blame myself more and more to the point where I become self-destructive. I would still like to help a partner, but not become a danger to myself due to prioritizing attachment over my self-worth. Okay, so, I mean, it sounds like you kind of answered your own question there. I blame myself more and more to the point where I become self-destructive. So yesterday when we talked about being a rescuer, right? We talked about how there's a couple different ways that people implement being a rescuer. So being a rescuer in and of itself is not indicative of attachment style, because there's a couple different ways that that rescuing behavior plays out with both anxious and avoidant attachment styles. So in this case, it sounds more like an anxious attachment style, because it's being turned in on the self. So sometimes, so if you have an avoidant attachment style and you find yourself in a rescuer role, it's usually because by playing the rescuer, you actually maintain a certain level of distance, emotional distance between you and your partner. The role is clearly defined. The person you are rescuing is embodying all of the icky, uncomfortable, difficult feelings, and they're acting them out and they're misbehaving. And so then you get to be the person who comes in and has it together and supports them and rescues them, and you're the savior in the relationship. And so the emotional expression becomes kind of constrained by the limits of that role, right? So for an avoidant partner, that becomes comfortable in a sense, because then there's always a measure of distance between you and your partner. Now, if a partner starts to pull it together, right, or they start to pull themselves together and get their life together, shape up, right, get with the program, now the drama cycle that gets created in a rescuer savior dynamic starts to relax. It starts to quell. And so so you have two partners, when all of that drama cycle energy is actively like going like this between you, you can't actually reach each other. But let's say this person, as I said before, starts changing their tune, and now they're becoming a little more accessible. They're softening. They're starting to take more responsibility for themselves. They're like, okay, yeah, no, I think I'm ready to really show up more authentically in this relationship. So now all that energy between them starts to slow. It becomes more fluid. Now there's actually the possibility of a real connection between you, because you don't have to be constrained by these roles anymore. Now, if this person has more of an avoidant attachment style belying their rescuer tendencies, then they may bow out, because that wasn't the deal. What do you mean? That's not the deal. That wasn't our unspoken unconscious agreement in this relationship dynamic. And so they don't know how to be in that situation anymore. So they kind of bow out. Now, if this person has a more anxious underpinnings in their attachment style and dynamic, and this person starts to soften up, they may actually become more avoidant in a sense. They probably won't leave, but they may become more distant in a sense, still in the context of the relationship, because now the rescued partner is changing up the dynamic as well. And so this partner tends to give more of themselves. So anytime this person misbehaves, right? Anytime this person misbehaves, then this partner is going to take it on themselves and say, oh, they're misbehaving. It must be my fault. So I'm not loving them well enough. I need to love them more and more in order to make them feel more loved, in order for this relationship to work. And so the more they misbehave, the more they're going to like give love to them, and oh, I'm doing this wrong, I'm doing this wrong. So they start beating themselves up the more this person misbehaves. Now, if this person stops misbehaving, okay, and this is the person who beats themselves up a lot. So now let's say this person's starting to behave better. You would assume that this person would start to behave better, right? Start to feel better about themselves because so-and-so is behaving. But the same thing happens. This person too is addicted to a kind of drama cycle. Okay. So now we have a shift in the polarity. So now this person might actually start to question, well, they don't need me anymore. If they're starting to love themselves well enough as they are to take responsibility for themselves and start showing up in a real way in the relationship, now I have to pay attention to how I'm not actually showing up authentically in this relationship because I'm relying too much on this role that I'm playing, and they don't need me anymore. And if they don't need me, who am I? What am I? Why would they even love me? And so either they can start to flip and become more avoidant themselves, or you start to see them looking to generate crisis situations so that the system remains in the balance that it was, though they're less likely to bow out of the relationship. But they might become less attracted. They might lose their sexual attraction, but then remain in the relationship and then tell themselves that they settled. Okay. But that's kind of how, just to touch upon that question again, we talked a little more about it yesterday. If you didn't see the live stream yesterday and you want to watch it, it's the radical truth about rescuers and 4 questions to break the habit. We have some more questions here. Yesterday was the first time I got to hear how he feels about us and what he wants, and we are 10 months in. Okay, not bad. Okay, Vanessa Santi's song. I actually think 10 months is like good, actually, to be honest with you. Songs, movies, and societal norms make you think that limerence is the goal, and it's rare and misleading for sure. Yes, so limerence is like infatuation, for those of you that don't know. Certainly, there's a lot of pop culture that leads us towards limerence, right? Or leads us towards love as being an expression of something that's hot and fiery and fast and all of that. But really, it's about character, and it's about values, and it's about do your values and your needs match up? And we kind of talked about this before. I have another video on my YouTube channel called The Radical Truth About Neediness, but that we often have this misconception that love has to be equated with need satisfaction. And it doesn't. You can love someone who doesn't meet any of your needs, but would that be the person to build a life with? I think we can all agree probably not, right? It also depends on how you want to construct your life. Long-term commitments are really about structure. They're really about how do you want to structure your life. It's not romantic. I mean, it is romantic and it's not. It's not romantic to those of us that have experienced the highs and the lows of infatuation or love bombing or limerence, right? That doesn't sound very romantic to us, that we want to remain in that state of a high all the time. But when you find yourself being caught in that kind of cycle, you realize that oftentimes when you are caught and or drawn to those types of cycles, you're usually in a performative state. You're often in a performative state, and it's really hard to relax. And it's really hard to sustain a long-term commitment if you cannot relax, right? And so when we talk about a kind of love that is a binding and that is sort of beyond preoccupation with need satisfaction, then that's the irony, is then you start to meet someone who can actually get some of your needs met, because once you're able to remove the expectation that they are going to fill you up in the way that we've been talking about today, then it's actually safer for people to show up more fully. That's sort of the paradox of it. So I guess the summary of today's video would be that you can only be authentic to the degree that you know yourself. And if you want people to show up authentically and emotionally honest in emotionally honest ways in a relationship, then the first thing to do is start looking at where you need to start being emotionally honest with yourself. And the more you can do that, then the less afraid you will be to show up fully in those kinds of conversations, right? So thank you to everybody who showed up for our call here today. I'm at the end of my time limit here, but I will be back tomorrow, same time, same place, answering more questions. And tomorrow I'm just going to leave it open to Q&A. So I'm not going to bring any pre-prepared information. We'll just see what comes out of the discussion. So thank you everybody for joining me, and I hope that you have a great day.